What is going on, everybody? What is going on, D Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the quarterback position for Week 7 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. Really does help us out if you guys consider subscribing to the channel and hit that like button. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Saints at the Cardinals. We need to kind of sit back and evaluate the Saints quarterbacks here throughout the week because Andy Dalton is dealing with a back injury, and then Jameis Winston, on the other hand, is also recovering from a back injury as well as an ankle injury. So we're not exactly sure who the starter is going to be. Some reports are leaning towards Andy Dalton. Some reports are leaning towards Winston having the possibility to go in Week 7. Either way, I'm really trying to stay away from these Thursday night matchups as a whole, so I'm not in love with either option, and really the quarterback play has been relatively mediocre overall, especially out of Andy Dalton, so I don't think they're great starts. I mean, if you're in a league where you can start Taysom Hill at the quarterback position, or in a super flex league where you can play him as a quarterback, if depending on Dalton Winston's health, Hill could be a solid play this week. But other than that, I think we just sit Jameis Winston if he starts, and I think we're definitely not starting Andy Dalton if he's the starter. So ultimately, let's sit back and see what happens with the New Orleans Saints quarterback's health overall as we approach Week 7. But regardless, I don't have either of them as starts moving into Week 7. All right, Kyler Murray is coming off of a very disappointing fantasy day in a matchup against the Seahawks that I thought would be a really good game script for fantasy overall, and it just wasn't at the end of the day. But I've still got Kyler Murray as a start here in Week 7, but I really don't like these Thursday night matchups, so I don't see a crazy ceiling for Kyler Murray. But we do have to respect the fact that he's still quarterback 6 in fantasy football. In Week 6 against Seattle, like I said, it wasn't great. 15.8 fantasy points, 222 passing yards, and a score through the air. He also added 100 yards on the ground off of 10 rushing attempts. That was his best performance on the ground by far on the season. Obviously, the big news for the Cardinals moving into Week 7 is that Hollywood Brown is going to miss an extended period of time with an ankle injury. But on top of that, we've got DeAndre Hopkins returning from suspension to this receiving core, which is a huge upgrade on top of the huge downgrade with Hollywood going out. Then the Cardinals have also traded for wide receiver Robbie Anderson. Not exactly sure how well that's going to mesh. Time will tell. So overall, there's some positivity for the Cardinals and some negativity in terms of this offense. So I think for a majority of you guys, it might be something to consider to just sit back and watch Kyler Murray with a little bit different offense without Hollywood Brown on a Thursday night matchup, a short week. I just don't love Kyler. That's why he's got the asterisk. But at the same time, he's just too good of a quarterback from a fantasy perspective to sit. I'm a little bit worried with what we've seen the last 2 weeks, although Philadelphia is a tough matchup. Seattle concerned me more because I really thought that this was going to be a good matchup when you look at Seattle's defense for Kyler, and I just don't like these Thursday night matchups. But at the end of the day, I'm still leaving Kyler Murray as a start as we move into Week 7. All right, Packers at Commanders. I'm starting Aaron Rodgers, but this really should be a name that has an asterisk next to it as well. I mean, you're starting Aaron Rodgers if you have to, right? We've got a couple of key quarterbacks on bye week this week, right? We got Jalen Hurts out. We got Josh Allen out for example. So if you're in a position where you have to start Rodgers, I'm not totally against it, but guys, Rodgers is your quarterback 20 on the season. Really, the only reason that I have him as a start here is because I think it's a pretty good matchup overall against the Commanders, who haven't actually played awful defensively, but they haven't played great. They look good against the Bears, but we really shouldn't be counting that last week, right? So I think you start Rodgers if you have to, but just don't expect a high ceiling here. I mean, I hope we can get more than 17 points out of Aaron Rodgers in this matchup. That's his ceiling on the year so far. So like I said, Rodgers is a start, but really, quite frankly, only if you have to overall. All right, Carson Wentz is going to miss at least 4 weeks recovering from thumb surgery. So Wentz is out. That means the man, the myth, the legend, Taylor Heineke will be stepping in for the Washington Commanders. He's going to be a sit for me. I mean, I've always rooted for Taylor Heineke, but he's a sit for me against the Packers. I mean, the Packers defense is pretty good overall, and we just want to sit back and see what happens. But it is worth noting that last season, Heineke as a starter had multiple 20-plus point fantasy performances. I mean, a handful of them, at least 4 to 5 on the season, so nothing crazy. But I mean, there might be some solid matchups for Heineke coming up. He gets Minnesota in week 9. Could be some good fantasy points there. Then he gets Philadelphia. I don't like that at all. Then he gets Houston in week 11, then Atlanta. So, like, there are a couple matchups where Heineke could have some opportunities, but I don't think against the Packers here in week 7 is going to be one of those opportunities. All right, Browns at Ravens. Jacoby Brissett's going to be a sit for me, coming in as your quarterback, 17 overall. So, I mean, he's 3 spots in front of Aaron Rodgers, who I had as a start. But, you know, I have more confidence in Aaron Rodgers than Jacoby Brissett, who had 10.6 fantasy points in week 6, 266 passing yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. This is a pretty good matchup against the Baltimore Ravens defense, but he's faced plenty of not so great defenses on the season, has performed not so great from a fantasy perspective. So I don't think there's a lot to talk about here. I don't think Brissett is going to be a streaming option or an option that we start moving into the week. All right, you're starting Lamar Jackson on a weekly basis. He's quarterback 2 overall in fantasy, even with having a little bit of some struggles in the last couple weeks, right? 15 points in week 4, 15.7 in week 5, 17.1 in week 6. I mean, really, overall, he doesn't have a lot of help through the receiving game, and the running back position's been just so all over the place that, like, outside of Mark Andrews, there's just not a lot of consistency on this team. And I really can't see why Jackson has been struggling, so to speak. But when you look at what he did in week 6, right? 210 passing yards, a touchdown, and pick, 77 yards on the ground, 2 fumbles, and a lost fumble, right? There's definitely some bad aspects of that performance. But Lamar Jackson and what he does is still, you know, there, right? 77 yards on the ground and 210 passing yards is his 4th most passing yards on the season. So, like, listen. There's not a lot of debate here. I know that Jackson has been struggling. I know that some of you guys out there have been a little bit worried, but you still have to start Jackson. You just can't bench him with the potential ceiling he brings on a weekly basis. All right, Buccaneers at Panthers. Man, I really thought Tom Brady was in line for his best performance of the season in week 6 against Pittsburgh, but we saw what happened, man. I mean, Pittsburgh won that football game. Brady only threw 1 touchdown. He had 243 passing yards. 13.7 fantasy points. That was his 3rd worst performance on the season. An absolutely mind-boggling game. But regardless, you have to start Tom Brady. I mean, maybe you don't have to, but I do like him in this matchup. And I do think that he is a player that should be a start. And it's just hard to say because the Steelers are probably a worse matchup than the Panthers. And I still feel like you need to start him against the Panthers this week. So if you have better options, if Brady's your QB2, you're more comfortable with your QB1, that's fine. But overall, I think even coming off of a bad performance, you can continue to start Brady here in week 7, and hopefully he bounces back from what we saw last week. Okay, nothing to really talk about in terms of the Panthers quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield is considered week to week. PJ Walker was he threw for 60 yards. And that was really it. Nothing to see there before he himself got injured and had to leave Sunday's matchup. So there's really nothing to discuss here. We're not considering starting either the Panthers quarterbacks, regardless of who's healthy and who's not, moving into week 7 against a stout Buccaneers defense. All right, Falcons at Bengals. I'm sitting Marcus Mariota, even coming off of his best performance on the season. I mean, 3 touchdowns overall in this game, 1 on the ground, 2 through the air, 129 passing yards and 50 rushing yards against a really good San Francisco 49ers defense. But this is really, I'm just worried it was a fluke game. Don't get me wrong, guys. If you're in a position where you need to stream and Marcus Mariota is the only quarterback available for you this week, I'm not completely against it, considering what he did against the Niners last week, and even the fact that he played pretty well against Tampa Bay in week 5 at 17.9 fantasy points. But the Bengals defense has been pretty good on the season, and I just don't want to trust Marcus Mariota because, you know, you go back a couple weeks, week 4, 4.8 points against Cleveland, 14 points against Seattle, 14 points against the Rams. So maybe he is better to start against good defenses and to sit against bad defenses, but I just don't trust Marcus Mariota. Like I said, if you need to stream him, I'm okay with it if there aren't better streaming options out there. On the other hand, Joe Burrow has been playing really good football so far on the season. He's your quarterback 5 in fantasy. I mean, I get it 18 points in week 5, 15.5 points in week 2, but outside of that, 20 or more fantasy points in every other matchup this season. And his best performance on the year was week 6 against New Orleans Saints, 32.5 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns through the air, 300 passing yards, and a rushing touchdown, 25 yards on the ground as well. This was one of those games where it really felt like Joe Burrow and, company, Jamar Chase, right, looked how they were supposed to be looking all season long. I think that's only going to help the confidence of Burrow and the rest of this offensive roster. I like the matchup overall. Not a lot of debate here. You're starting Joe Burrow moving into week 7. Our Lions at Cowboys. I'm sitting Jared Goff because I do still believe in this Cowboys defense. And in week 5, Goff did not look good whatsoever against New England Patriots. I know there's some offensive players not playing in that game, but at the same time, he had a fumble loss and he had an interception. He did not throw a single touchdown, and 229 passing yards through the air was only enough to get you 6.86 fantasy points. And even with the Cowboys having their worst defensive performance of the year against the Eagles this past week, and I mean, it was the Eagles, right? I still believe in this Cowboys defense. I'm a little bit wary of Jared Goff, but we do have to look at the fact that he's still a top 12 quarterback on the season. And I know there are enough fantasy managers out there who are going to have to stream this week. For some leagues out there, it may not be that big of a deal. You may have a second quarterback in like a 10-man league, but I know some of you guys play in 14-man leagues, 16-man leagues, 20-man leagues. I know some of you guys play in super flex leagues and double quarterback leagues, and you have to consider these options, right? So I do understand, right, if Jared Goff is a player who you have to consider starting, I'm not completely against it because I still have some faith in this offense, although they've been trending downward. But just don't forget, we're not that far removed from Jared Goff having 34.2 fantasy points just 3 weeks ago. Although, I mean, let's face it, that was against Seattle. So all I'm saying, it's a tough matchup for a majority of fantasy leagues. I don't want to start Jared Goff this week, but if you absolutely have to, I think that you could, right? All right, looking at the Cowboys, it looks like Dak Prescott is expected to practice this week and suit up for week 7's matchup against the Lions. Listen, guys, I've got Prescott as a start mainly because his Lions defense has been 110% absolutely abysmal on the season. But I'm always a little bit worried, right? I always like to kind of sit back and see a quarterback or most players come back from an injury just to see what happens, just to see, usually that first game back, if it's been a long-term injury, just let him kind of get back into the rhythm of things. You might see some hiccups in a matchup like this. But because of the Lions defense, I'm willing to start Dak Prescott moving into week 7. All right, Giants at Jaguars. I'm just going to call this my streaming matchup of the week. And don't get me wrong, I believe in the Giants defense. You've been playing pretty good. We got to give them some kudos. And I believe in the Jaguars defense. They've been playing pretty good as well. But both of these defenses have been playing just bad enough that I think you can stream Daniel Jones and Trevor Lawrence here in week 7. I won't be surprised if either quarterback, or both quarterbacks, I should say, has a turnover. But overall, I still think we can stream Danny Dimes and Trevor Lawrence moving into the week. Daniel Jones is your QB 15 in fantasy, just 13.5 fantasy points in week 6. 2 touchdowns through the air and a fumble loss. We'd really like to see some more passing yards or some of that rushing upside that Daniel Jones was showing in previous weeks come back, so we could get a better ceiling overall, because through the air he played fine, but we're just not getting really good ceilings out of Danny Dimes. So I think he's an okay stream for the week if you need to, but I would not expect a massive performance whatsoever. Looking at Trevor Lawrence, on the other hand, he had his second best fantasy performance of the season in week 6 against the Colts. 24.9 fantasy points, 165 passing yards, a touchdown, 23 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns. Really savored his fantasy stat line there. Listen, guys, Trevor Lawrence comes in as your quarterback 9 on the season, so you could easily argue that he should just be a start moving into the week. But like I said, I do have some faith in this Giants defense overall, and I won't be surprised if we see a turnover out of Trevor Lawrence in this game. So at the end of the day, guys, there's some risk and volatility to starting either Daniel Jones or Trevor Lawrence, but I know this is a week for a lot of fantasy managers where you have to kind of take a risk with some key quarterbacks on bye week. So like I said, this is my streaming matchup of the week. Daniel Jones and Trevor Lawrence are two quarterbacks you can consider here in week 7. All right, Colts at Titans. Look at it. I got one more streaming game for you, and that would be the Colts at the Titans. I think you can stream Matt Ryan this week. I don't have a lot of faith in that Titans secondary. They've been playing pretty good up front. Don't get me wrong. And once again, I won't be surprised if we see a turnover or two maybe from Matt Ryan in this game, but coming off of his best fantasy performance of the year against Jacksonville at 27.1 fantasy points, 389 passing yards, and 3 passing touchdowns, I do think, there's a possibility that with Alec Pierce really coming to life, Michael Pittman getting going again, and hopefully Jonathan Taylor coming back to this offense in week 7, that we could see a Colts offense put up a good performance overall against the Tennessee Titans in a divisional game. And the last time Matt Ryan faced the Tennessee Titans in week 4, he had 18.8 fantasy points. So I see a pretty safe floor coming out of Matt Ryan moving into week 7. On the other hand, Ryan Tannehill is your quarterback 25 on the season. Hasn't been great whatsoever. When he faced the Colts in week 4, he had 14.3 fantasy points. Obviously, the Titans were on bye week in week 6. But once again, I see a safe enough floor within this matchup to stream Ryan Tannehill if you absolutely need to. Listen, I like Daniel Jones, Trevor Lawrence, and Matt Ryan more than Ryan Tannehill, but I could see this divisional game being a game where the defenses kind of let up a little bit like we saw out of the Colts and the Jaguars last week. So I think if you need to, not my favorite stream, but if you need to, you can stream Ryan Tannehill against the Colts here in week 7. All right, Texans at Raiders, man. Davis Mills has just been disappointing on the season. No more than 15.8 fantasy points so far on the year in week 5. He was on bye week in week 6. So last time he played week 5 against Jacksonville, 5.8 fantasy points, 140 yards through the air, no scores. There's nothing to discuss here. Davis Mills is a sit for us moving into week 7. Derek Carr, on the other hand, is your quarterback 18 on the season. You know what you're getting out of Derek Carr. The ceiling's not great. Hopefully he gets you closer to 20 fantasy points, but overall you're probably getting somewhere between 14 and 18 fantasy points. Listen, the Texans aren't a great defense, but they also haven't been playing awful. So I wouldn't expect a crazy high ceiling against Derek Carr here in week 7, but it is a good enough matchup overall that I think you can start Derek Carr. And man, does this Raiders team need a victory coming out of the bye? I do think this could be one of the better performances for the Raiders on the season because, man, if they lose this game, I mean, this season may be lost overall. So I think you can start Derek Carr. He's basically solidified into the starting category, but man, the ceilings just aren't high. He's like last year's Kirk Cousins, and Kirk Cousins is in a similar tier, maybe just a couple spots ahead of Derek Carr. But overall, you can start him in week 7. Just don't expect a whole lot. All right, Jets at Broncos. I've got both quarterbacks as a sit in this matchup. I see this game turning into a defensive game, and if it doesn't, I think most of the offensive work's going to be done on the ground. So I think you sit Zach Wilson coming off of a 4.5 fantasy performance against Green Bay in week 6. I think you sit Russell Wilson. I mean, he looked good in the first half of the Monday Night Football game against the Chargers and then just did nothing. And I mean nothing in the second half. 13.8 fantasy points on the night. I thought we were finally going to get a solid fantasy performance out of Russell Wilson, but we haven't seen anything since week 4 against the Las Vegas Raiders, where he had 27.4 fantasy points, and maybe you could argue in week 1 against Seattle, where he had 17.8 fantasy points. And at the same time, he's dealing with a hamstring injury. He's considered day-to-day. So I just don't like this matchup for either quarterback involved as we approach week 7. All right, Chiefs at Niners. I like this matchup for both quarterbacks involved. And obviously, Patty Mahomes is a weekly start. He's your quarterback 4 in fantasy in week 6 against Buffalo. 21.6 fantasy points, 338 passing yards, 2 scores, and 2 interceptions. But this game script was just a game script where you're going to see some interceptions. And the defense has played pretty well, all things considered, with those 2 offenses out there. So, Patty Mahomes, not a lot to say here. Quarterback 4 on the season, 17 touchdowns through the first 6 weeks of the season. You're going to start Patrick Mahomes we can move right along, even with the Niners being a pretty stout defense overall. Jimmy G, on the other hand, I think he's a good stream this week. He's got at least 18 fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, and the Chiefs defense hasn't been playing that great, especially against opposing quarterbacks. So I think if you need to stream Jimmy G, don't expect a really high ceiling, but I know there's a lot of fantasy managers out there who are in need of a quarterback moving into the week. I think Jimmy G is a perfectly fine option. All right, Seahawks at Chargers. I think you can continue to stream Geno Smith moving into week 7, even after having just 12.6 fantasy points against Arizona. He's still your quarterback 7 on the season. I think that the Chargers defense is not great. They played better against the Broncos than I thought they would. But really, when we look at this run defense, it's been bad. And overall, the secondary has not played that well. But listen, like I said, Geno Smith, your quarterback 7. I mean, only 197 passing yards in week 6, 48 yards on the ground, and a fumble, no touchdowns. After having 24 points in week 5 and 31 in week 4. So I think he gets back to maybe a little bit of a higher ceiling, and definitely a better ceiling than what we saw in week 6. Okay, I continue to have faith in Justin Herbert. I'm starting him on a weekly basis, even after having just 9.4 fantasy points in week 6. He still comes in as your quarterback 8 on the season. Did not throw a touchdown in week 6. I don't know how many of you guys saw that DraftKings boost on the week. A little bit suspicious for Justin Herbert to throw at least 1 touchdown. Odds were plus 100. Anyways, a little bit suspicious. But Justin Herbert came on the game with no touchdowns in week 6. I think he easily bounces back against a really bad Seattle Seahawks defense here in week 7. I will continue to have faith in Justin Herbert, even coming off of 2 poor performances against Cleveland and Denver. I think he'll be good to go here in week 7. All right, moving on to the Steelers at Dolphins. I'm sitting these Steelers quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett remains in concussion protocol, and Mitchell Trubisky is expected to be the starting quarterback in week 7. In his first 4 starts on the season, he had no more than 14.9 fantasy points. In relief of Pickett in week 6, he came into the game and played pretty well. 10.2 fantasy points, 12 passing attempts, 9 completions, 144 passing yards, and a touchdown. But I don't have any faith in either of these Steelers quarterbacks at the moment. If we see a consistent pattern emerge for either of them, then we can talk. But as we approach week 7, I'm going to sit these Steelers quarterbacks, and I'm sure you are as well. Moving into week 7, on the other hand, for the Miami Dolphins, it looks like Tua is going to be our starting quarterback. Now, there's still a chance that we see Teddy Two Gloves line up here, who came into the game when Skylar Thompson suffered a thumb injury, in week 6. But from what I have read, it looks like Tua is going to be the starter in week 7. I say start Tua. I really do, man. Listen, like I said, for some of these players like Dak Prescott, I like to kind of sit back and see what happens when a quarterback comes back from a serious injury. But hey, I have the faith that Tua is going to come out here and perform well against the Steelers defense. So I say line up Tua. If you have better options, roll with them. But if you don't, if you're struggling and Tua's coming back, I think he might be coming back to give your fantasy team a solid stat line here in week 7. All right, Monday Night Football, we got the Bears at the Patriots. I'm sitting Justin Fields, who's coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season at 19.4 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders. Finished the game with 190 passing yards, a touchdown, an interception, and 88 yards on the ground, a season high for rushing yards. But I believe in this New England Patriots defense. I think they're going to have a really good day overall. I think this is going to be a run first game and a play defense first game for both of these teams. Looking at the New England Patriots, are we in line for a quarterback controversy? We'll find out. Looks like Mac Jones is more than likely going to miss week 7, but he has a chance to play in week 7. And man, Bailey Zappe's been playing good football at the quarterback position. Nothing crazy, right? But he's been managing these games very well. Patriots have been playing defense and running the football before passing, and Bailey has improved every single week, right? 18.3 fantasy points against Cleveland in week 6 is not that bad. 309 passing yards, guys. 2 touchdowns. So he did have a lost fumble, and the Browns haven't been playing great defensively, but we got to give this man some props, right? At the same time, I don't really want to start him. I don't have the confidence to do so here in week 7. If you're in a deep super flex or double quarterback league, you could consider Bailey Zappe, But that's about it for me moving in to week 7. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. And I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.